Okay, so we are going to go through what you guys should have seen on the e-learning video, basically how to classify um, day-to-day objects, okay? So let's just quickly run through as a recap. What is classification? How do we classify things? Okay, and how do we show the classification of things? Basically, after we have decided how to classify things, how can we actually list them out? Okay, so here we have a mixture of different shapes of different sizes, okay? And the shapes are also of different colors. So there are a few ways to classify these shapes, okay? What are some ways that y'all can think of? So basically, when we think about classifying things, okay, we need to figure out what are the common characteristics of the objects that we want to classify. So if we look at the characteristics of the shapes, you notice that I mentioned different shapes, right? So shapes can be considered one characteristic. Okay, so characteristic is basically like a property or something that the object possesses or has. So for example, the characteristic of a cat is that it has whiskers, it has four legs. The characteristic of a fish is that it has a tail, it's found underwater, okay, it can swim. So those are characteristics, okay, properties or what the object has or possesses. So in this case, if you look at the picture, okay, we see that one method of classifying the different shapes, is based on the shape itself. Okay, so we have triangle shape, we have square, and we have circles. So we can classify the shapes according to their shapes. Another method of classifying them, okay, is we can look at their color. So the objects also have different colors, and that's a characteristic of the objects that we see here. So what colors do we see? We see red, we see blue, and we see yellow. So we can also classify the objects above, okay, based on their color. So color is another characteristic of the objects in the table above. One more. We can also classify the objects based on their size. Okay, so if you look very closely, we have objects of smaller size that I have highlighted or underlined in red. And we have objects of slightly bigger size that I have outlined in green. Okay, so the size of the object can also be considered a characteristic of the object. So I'm just going to write here size, big or small, can also be a characteristic. All right, so please take note. Whenever we think about classification, we need to think about what are the common characteristics when we put the objects into groups. Okay, so the objects in the same groups usually will have the same characteristics. Now, when we look at this box, okay, you see several items. In fact, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 items in this box. Okay, so what is one way to classify the objects in this box or the items in this box? Have a think. In fact, there are two ways to classify these objects. So the first way, okay, it's actually the one that comes to mind the easiest, at least to my mind, okay, is whether or not they are living or non-living things. So in the next chapter, next week, okay, we will explore what are the characteristics of living things and what are the characteristics of non-living things. But most of you should know it's common sense. You all should be able to identify from the table, okay, which are living and which are non-living. So very quickly, non-living, table, lamp, plate, television, chair. Okay, so all these in the right-hand side of this table are non-living things, okay? On the left-hand side, we're going to classify the living things. We have bird, cat, snake, elephant, and goldfish. All right, so this is the first classification. Now, if you think harder, okay, there's actually another way to classify the objects. Carefully look at the objects. You will realize that some objects in the table have legs. Some objects in the table do not have legs. All right, so which objects have legs? The table. All tables, if you think about a table, right, it has legs. The lamp also kind of have a leg to support it. Correct? The plate does not have a leg. The bird has legs. So if I were to draw, you can't really draw a bird, but right, it has legs. The cat, as I mentioned just now, has 4 legs. The elephant has legs as well. All right, the rest of the objects you'll realize do not have legs. The snake does not have legs. The television does not have legs. The goldfish does not have legs. Sorry, I have to put chair here. All right, so this is actually another way to classify the objects, the characteristics of having legs and not having legs. All right, so these are 2 ways that we can classify the objects in the table. So generally, how do we classify things around us? Okay, they can be classified into living or non-living things. So these are usually the broadest category, okay, when we look at classifying things. So in next week, okay, we will be looking at how to differentiate how can I tell whether something is living or non-living? So what are the characteristics of living things and what are the characteristics of non-living things? Okay, so under living things, they can be further classified into body covering. So for example, fish have scales, birds have feathers, mammals have fur. Okay, how they move. So as you know, some animals can swim, some animals can fly, some animals just simply walk, and how they reproduce. So as you know, most fish lay eggs, but mammals, they actually give birth to their young alive. Okay, so that's some further broad categories in which we can classify living things. Of course, these are not the whole, all the ways that we can classify living things. There are many, many ways in which we can classify living things, and we'll be looking into that in detail in the further weeks to come. Okay, so for non-living things, generally, they can be classified according to their shape, their color, their texture, properties of materials they are made of, so on and so forth. We will also explore that in the later weeks to come. All right, so this is just a brief idea of the general classification of things that we encounter in our day-to-day lives. Now, how do we represent classifications? So we have learned that objects that are similar, we put them into groups, okay? But how can we display or write down, okay, or show our teacher or examiners how we can group these objects or these things? So the first way we can classify things is in tables. So as you saw just now, okay, we classified the objects in the dark blue table below into tables with 2 columns. Okay, and this was the heading that described the characteristic that we were going to use for the classification, and we listed, okay, the objects or animals accordingly in the columns. So this is the table form. So we can classify in table, using a table. Okay, remember your headings always have to go on top. This is something that you might not have seen before. Okay, so this is considered a diagram. Okay, so a diagram has a header, or this is the most general, it tells us what we are classifying, living things. All right, and then it breaks down further into characteristics. So the further you move down the diagram, the more information you get, right? So for example, if I were to look at the water moss fern, I will be able to know a lot, the different characteristics of the water moss fern based on the information from the diagram. So if teacher was to ask, name the characteristics. So remember, characteristics is properties, right? Of the water moss fern. This can be an exam question. Okay, so imagine question is this, characteristics of the water moss fern. So you move up the diagram. First I see, oh, the water moss fern lives in the water. The second thing, the water moss fern makes its own food. And of course, it is a living thing. Okay, so I can actually name 3 characteristics. It is a living thing that can make its own food. And lives in the water. Okay, so you can see in my answer, I actually have 3 characteristics. All of the information or all of the characteristics I got from the diagram itself. So this diagram is actually very useful. All right, so let's try again. The swordtail, what are the characteristics of the swordtail? So I move up the diagram. It lives in water. It feeds on other living things, and it's a living thing. Okay, so this second way to classify things is using a diagram. All right, so it branches downwards. As I move further down the diagram, I get more information or more characteristics of the object or the item or the animal even, or the living thing, sorry. Okay, so this is called a flow chart. Now, students will find this the most complicated lah. Honestly, I don't think it is very complicated once you get the hang of it and once you practice enough or once you actually see it enough. So on first glance, it might look a bit scary, okay? But the more you actually encounter this kind of flow charts, the more you will find it quite manageable. So what is a flow chart? The characteristic of a flow chart is, unlike the diagram, right? You see question mark. So the flow chart has how do I know that it is a flow chart is that it has questions and there are yes, no options. So you see yes, no, no, yes, so on and so forth. You don't see this in the diagram. Okay, there are arrows in the diagram, there are boxes in the diagram, but you don't see questions and you don't see yes, no options. So basically, the yes, no options will lead you to different parts of the flow chart. So if you follow me, okay, you follow my guidance. If we look at living things, okay, let me use a different color. If we look at living things, the first question is, can it make its own food? So depending on whether it can make its own food, I will branch into the right-hand side or downwards. Okay, so if I cannot make my own food, the next question is, can it move on its own? Okay, so similarly, whether or not you answer no or yes, I will branch into the items that I actually want to classify. So if I look at the ant, what are the characteristics of the ant? I move up, can make